Thursday, March 18th, 1943. Camp Oasis, Sonoran Desert, Arizona. Oberfeldwebel Erika Schneider's knees nearly buckled as the transport truck shuddered to a halt on the sun-bleached parade ground. Through the canvas flap, she glimpsed something that contradicted every briefing, every propaganda film, every assurance from Berlin about the weakness of the American fighting man. Standing in formation beneath the merciless Arizona sun were guards whose physical presence alone dismantled 3 years of indoctrination in a single glance. The heat struck first, a wall of dry furnace air that sucked moisture from her lungs. Then came the smell: creosote from desert shrubs, motor oil from idling vehicles, and something else entirely unexpected: fresh paint. Not the peeling years-old paint of European barracks, but new, deliberate maintenance. The compound gleamed. "Got him, Himmel," whispered Clara Hoffman, the signals operator from Munich, pressing close behind her. "Look at them." Erika looked. Sergeant Jake "The Rock" Stevens. His name would be learned later, but his physical reality was immediately, undeniably apparent, stood at attention in the center guard position. His shoulders filled his uniform in a way that suggested not deprivation, but abundance. Not weakness, but cultivated strength. Beside him, other guards displayed similar physiques: broad, well-fed, powerful. These were not the degenerate mongrels of a dying civilization that Dr. Goebbels' newsreels had promised. "These men could probably lift our transport truck," Erika heard herself say, the words escaping before propaganda conditioning could suppress them. Around her, 49 other women of the Jupiter military service, wireless operators, cipher clerks, administrative personnel captured during the North African collapse, stood frozen in the cognitive dissonance of that first moment. The seed of doubt, once planted, proves impossible to uproot entirely. Erika Margarete Schneider had entered military service in Hamburg on September 14, 1940, 3 days after her 20th birthday. Her father, a schoolteacher, had died in the Great War. Her mother cleaned houses for Reich officials. The military offered escape from poverty, purpose in a reordering world, and, according to recruitment posters, participation in Germany's inevitable triumph. She'd believed every word. The training lectures had been explicit. The Americans are a mongrel race without discipline or martial virtue. They are soft from luxury, corrupted by democracy, incapable of sacrifice. 1 German soldier equals 10 Americans. Their economy is a paper facade. Their military is a social club for incompetence. By early 1943, Erika had served in signals intelligence operations across France and North Africa. She'd seen German rations shrink: 300 grams of bread daily, 120 grams of meat weekly when supply lines functioned, which grew increasingly rare. She'd watched soldiers thin to sinew and bone. She'd decoded messages describing retreat after retreat, each explained as strategic repositioning. She'd learned to ignore the grinding hunger, the way her uniform hung looser each month, the taste of ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. Then came capture near Kaiserin Pass, a sudden American artillery barrage, the command post collapsing, dust and screams and surrender, processing through Algiers. Then the transport ship to Norfolk, Virginia. The guards had been professional but distant. She'd expected death or degradation. Instead came bureaucracy, fingerprints, photographs, paperwork. And then the train westward, through a landscape that seemed to mock everything she'd been taught. The America she'd glimpsed through train windows bore no resemblance to a nation on the brink of collapse. Factories operated at full capacity, smokestacks punctuating horizons. Farms stretched in geometric abundance. Civilian automobiles, dozens, hundreds, thousands, moved freely on paved roads. In one Kansas town, she'd watched children emerge from a school building, laughing, well-dressed, carrying lunchboxes that probably contained more nutrition than she'd seen in weeks. Now, standing on this remote desert parade ground, the final illusion prepared to shatter, the statistical reality, had she known it then, would have explained everything. Steel production, 1942. Germany, 32. 1 million tons United States, 85. 4 million tons American advantage, 2. 7x oil production, 1942, Germany. 6 million barrels, including synthetic, United States. 4 billion barrels, American advantage. 184x aluminum production, 1942, Germany. 264,000 tons, United States. 834,000 tons, American advantage. 2x caloric intake, Average daily per capita 1943. German civilian. Wissauert 800 2,000 calories. Official ration often less in practice. German military 3,000 calories. Front line when supply permitted. American civilian 3,400 calories. American military 4,300 calories. American POW provision Geneva Convention standard 2,500 3,000 calories. Motor vehicles produced 1942. Germany 83,000. United States 8 million, including 700,000 military vehicles. American advantage 33 eeks. These numbers, abstract in isolation, would become viscerally real in the hours ahead. What Erika didn't know, standing in that first moment of confusion, was that Camp Oasis represented the American military's deliberate strategy. Treat prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards not out of weakness, but from a position of such overwhelming strength that generosity cost nothing. The camp commandant, Colonel Robert Hayes, operated under explicit orders. Demonstrate American capacity through proper treatment. Let them see what a democracy produces. The reality waiting behind that wire would accomplish what no propaganda film could prevent. It would transform certainty into doubt, doctrine into questions, and soldiers into witnesses to their own deception. The barracks assignment process began with a medical inspection that itself proved disconcerting. The camp physician, Captain David Rosenfeld, a Jewish doctor from New York whose existence contradicted propaganda claims about America's complete degradation, examined each woman with professional detachment. His instruments were new, his medications abundant, his manner revealing no trace of the cruelty they'd been promised. "Any injuries from transport?" he asked in accented but comprehensible German, learned from grandparents who'd emigrated in 1898. Erika showed him the rope burns on her wrists from the initial capture. He cleaned them with real iodine, not the watered-down solution she'd seen in German field hospitals, and applied fresh bandages. The medical supplies cabinet behind him stood open. Shelves of medications, surgical instruments gleaming under electric lights that never flickered, bottles of aspirin and sulfa drugs that German field hospitals hoarded desperately. "These will heal in a week," Dr. Rosenfeld said, his tone matter-of-fact. "If you develop fever or see redness, report immediately to sick call. We have penicillin if infection develops." Penicillin, the wonder drug that existed more in German rumors than reality. Here, mentioned casually as a backup option for minor rope burns. But Margaret Fisher, the logistics specialist from Dusseldorf who'd become Erika's closest companion during transport, voiced the suspicion poisoning even this mundane kindness. "Why treat us so well? What do you want from us?" Dr. Rosenfeld paused, considering. "I want you healthy because that's my job. Also, the Geneva Convention requires it, but mainly." He gestured at the gleaming medical bay. "We have the supplies. Why waste them?" The casual abundance embedded in that answer, "Why waste them?" would echo through the coming weeks. The barracks themselves delivered the next shock. Erika had expected cramped cells, perhaps concrete floors, certainly the damp cold that characterized German military housing. Instead, she entered a wooden structure that, while simple, demonstrated attention to habitability that seemed almost decadent by Wehrmacht standards. Each woman received one steel frame bed with inner spring mattress, not straw, 2 wool blankets, new, unstained, 1 pillow with cotton pillowcase, 1 footlocker for personal items, 1 designated shelf space. The windows had screens, actual manufactured screening to keep insects out, a luxury beyond German civilian housing. The floors were finished wood, regularly swept clean. In the corner stood a coal stove for winter heating, with coal apparently available without rationing. Electric lights overhead, controlled by wall switches, not flickering candles or precious oil lamps. "This is a trick," announced Oberfeldwebel Greta Zimmermann, a stern Prussian woman who'd served since 1938 and whose ideological rigidity had earned her the informal rank of political officer among the prisoners. She would become Erika's foil in the weeks ahead, the voice of unshakable faith against Erika's growing doubts. "They show us comfort to make us weak, to extract information. Notice how they separate us, give us individual beds to prevent solidarity." But Clara, ever the optimist despite 3 years of war, ran her hand along the mattress with undisguised wonder. "Greta, when did you last sleep on springs?" 1940. 1939. The question hung unanswered because everyone knew the truth. German military personnel, even officers, slept on straw ticks when they slept on anything at all. These American accommodations for prisoners, for captured enemies, exceeded what the Wehrmacht provided its own soldiers. The latrine facilities completed the trilogy of impossible comforts. Inside a separate building, clean and whitewashed, stood 10 flush toilets with actual porcelain fixtures, 6 sinks with running water, cold and hot, 3 shower stalls with functioning plumbing, soap, real soap, not the sandy lie-heavy blocks they'd known toilet paper in dispensers. Restocked weekly, Erika stood before a sink, turned the hot water tap experimentally, and watched steam rise. Behind her, women crowded close, some touching the water disbelievingly, others staring at their reflections in actual mirrors, real glass, not polished metal. In Hamburg, Margaret said quietly, we had hot water twice weekly, on bath days, and that was before the bombing intensified. In Munich, Clara added, public baths closed entirely in '42, fuel rationing. The comparisons emerged unbidden, each woman measuring this enemy prison against the civilization they'd left behind. The measurements yielded uncomfortable data. That first night, lying on a mattress that didn't crackle with straw, beneath blankets that smelled of fresh wool rather than mildew and other women's sweat, Erika found sleep elusive. The propaganda framework she'd carried like armor now showed fissures. If America is collapsing under the weight of its mongrel democracy, she thought, staring at electric lights that never dimmed for power conservation, why do their prisoners live better than our soldiers? If they're degenerate and weak, why does their weakness manifest as abundance? If we're the master race destined for triumph, why are we the ones who've been hungry for 3 years? Across the darkened barracks, Greta's voice cut through the silence. Don't let comfort corrupt you. This is a test of will. Remember what we fight for. Remember the Führer's promises. But several beds away, someone, Erika couldn't identify who in the darkness, whispered a response. I remember promises. What I'm seeing is plumbing. Suppressed laughter rippled through the barracks, quickly stifled. In that laugh and its guilty suppression, the psychological battle had begun. The next morning brought the first formation, and with it, the recurring presence of Sergeant Stevens. He stood before them, clipboard in hand, explaining in slow, clear English, with help from a translator, the camp routine. Wake at 0600, breakfast at 0630, work details at 0800, lunch at 1200, evening recreation at 1700, lights out at 2200. Work details, Greta demanded, her English surprisingly fluent. We're officers and specialists. Geneva Convention prohibits forced labor for voluntary work programs. Stevens interrupted, his voice carrying the patient firmness of someone accustomed to command. Kitchen assistants, library maintenance, groundskeeping. You're not required to participate. Those who do receive additional privileges, more recreation time, access to camp store, letter writing materials. He wasn't handsome in the classical sense. His nose had been broken at least once. A scar crossed his left eyebrow. His hands bore the calluses of hard labor, but his physical presence communicated competence, discipline, and a casual strength that made propaganda descriptions of American softness seem not just wrong, but laughably absurd. Later, as women dispersed to assigned areas, Erika found herself walking near Stevens as he conducted his rounds. On impulse, the first of many impulses that would characterize her transformation, she spoke. Sergeant, question. He turned, evaluated her with neutral professionalism. Schneider, right. Go ahead. Your, how you say, condition, your physical fitness, you and other guards. We were told Americans were weak, soft. He smiled without humor. Yeah, I've heard what your propaganda says about us, just like you've probably heard what ours says about you. He paused, considering whether to continue, then apparently decided transparency served his purposes. I played football at Ohio State before enlisting. Most of these guards worked farms, factories, or construction. We're not aristocrats' sons playing at war. We're working-class guys who eat 3 square meals a day and lift heavy things for a living. 3 meals. Daily. Daily. Sometimes 4 if you count midnight chow on guard duty. He studied her face, reading the calculations happening behind her eyes. How many meals were you getting before capture? 1.5, maybe 2 if supply convoy arrived. Right. He shifted his clipboard. Look, Schneider, I'm not supposed to editorialize, but here's the thing. Lying about small things, like how strong or weak your enemy is, that allows your leaders to lie about bigger things without you asking questions. You understand. She understood. The seed of doubt found fertile ground and sent down roots. It's a profound moment when a lifetime of belief begins to crumble. What piece of evidence do you think would be most shocking to someone in this position? We'd be fascinated to read your perspective in the comments. And if you appreciate these deep dives into the human side of history, consider subscribing for more stories like this. Saturday, October 2nd, 1943, Camp Oasis, Arizona. 6 months into internment had established routines, but nothing prepared the prisoners for Colonel Hayes' announcement on that cool autumn morning. In honor of Arizona's harvest season, and in keeping with Geneva Convention provisions for prisoner welfare, Camp Oasis will host a harvest festival next Saturday. There will be food, entertainment, and recreational activities. The word food hung in the air like an unexploded shell. Erika had spent these months observing, questioning, collecting evidence against the crumbling edifice of her indoctrination. She'd watched American guards casually discard half-eaten sandwiches, protein, and bread wasted without thought. She'd seen supply trucks arrive weekly, unloading crates with clockwork reliability that German logistics officers would have considered miraculous. She'd learned that the camp's hardship post designation came not from supply scarcity, but from summer heat and isolation concepts of hardship that now seemed almost quaint. But she'd also maintained emotional distance, accepting comfort without embracing it, participating in the psychological experiment of kindness without surrendering skepticism. Greta Zimmerman remained her ideological anchor, reminding her through daily interactions that comfort was a weapon, abundance a trap, kindness a manipulation. They fatten us like cattle, Greta would say, during their library work detail, a voluntary assignment that granted access to books, newspapers, admittedly censored, and conversation. They make us forget who we are, what we believe. Then they'll use us for propaganda, parade us as proof of German weakness. Yet even Greta's certainty showed microscopic fissures. Last week, when the camp doctor had treated her persistent cough with antibiotics, freely given, no interrogation required, she'd whispered almost to herself, "Such waste on enemies." The words could have meant criticism of American foolishness or acknowledgement of unexpected mercy. The ambiguity itself represented progress. The harvest festival preparations began 3 days early. Prisoners watched with growing astonishment as guards erected tables in the recreation yard, strung electric lights between buildings, and, most shockingly, began cooking in quantities that seemed to violate the laws of wartime physics. Sergeant Stevens, now familiar enough to exchange nods with Erika during his rounds, explained the menu with deadpan matter-of-factness: roast turkey, ham, beef brisket, mashed potatoes, green beans, corn on the cob, fresh baked rolls, apple pie, pumpkin pie, coffee, and lemonade. All of this for prisoners. Margret's voice cracked slightly. Well, for everyone. Guards eat the same food. Stevens checked his watch. Oh, and there's a surprise performance. Local USO group volunteered to come out. Music and comedy sketches. That night, Erika recorded in the journal she'd been permitted to keep, itself another Geneva Convention provision honored more faithfully by the Americans than by any Wehrmacht camp she'd heard of. October 2nd, 1943. They promise a feast. Not rations, but a feast. Greta says it's manipulation that we should refuse on principle. But I'm so tired of principle when my stomach knows different. Mother wrote last month the Red Cross finally delivered letters that Hamburg has 900 calories daily per person. Horse meat if you're lucky. Turnips always. Here, they're going to serve fresh turkey to people they're fighting. What does that mean? What kind of nation can afford to feast its enemies? Saturday, October 9th, 1943. The smell reached the barracks at dawn. Roasting meat. Real meat, not the mysterious protein blocks or horse meat stew they'd known. The scent carried on the desert air. Turkey skin crisping, ham glazing, beef smoking low and slow. With it came bread, yeast, and wheat in proportions that seemed to mock 3 years of ersatz everything. Clara literally wept. It smells like Christmas. It smells like before. At 1100 hours, Colonel Hayes formally invited the prisoners to the festival grounds. Most went immediately, drawn by hunger that transcended ideology. But Greta gathered her core loyalists, 12 women who'd maintained rigid adherence to National Socialist principles, and announced, "We fast. We show these Democrats that Germans cannot be bought with food." Erika stood at the crossroads between principle and reality, between who she'd been trained to be and what 6 months of evidence had revealed. The symbol that had recurred through her internment, a simple white ceramic coffee cup, German-made, that she'd been allowed to keep from her captured belongings, sat on her footlocker. In March, that cup represented home, civilization, superiority. By October, it had become a reminder that the nation which produced it couldn't feed its soldiers while the nation without it fed its enemies. "I'm going," Erika said quietly. "Not because I'm bought, because I'm tired of pretending abundance is weakness." Greta's face hardened. "Then you're lost." "Maybe. Or maybe I'm found." The festival grounds had been transformed. Long tables draped with white cloth, for outdoor dining, held serving dishes that triggered a physiological response before conscious thought, saliva, hunger, almost painful anticipation. The visual abundance alone exceeded propaganda's capacity to explain away. The numbers, had they been posted, would have told the story. Food prepared for 50 prisoners plus 30 guards plus 10 staff, 90 people. Turkey, 6 birds, 18-20 lbs each, 128 lbs total. Ham, 4 spiral cuts, 12 lbs each. More 48 lbs beef brisket, 40 lbs total protein. 200 lbs potatoes, 75 lbs vegetables, 50 lbs mixed bread, 30 loaves, pies, 12, 6 apples, 6 pumpkin, coffee, 15 gallons brewed, lemonade, 20 gallons protein per person if distributed equally. 2 lbs context, German military ration when available. 120 grams, 0. 26 lbs meat per day, German civilian ration, Hamburg, October 1943. 250 grams meat per week. This single meal contained 5 times the weekly meat ration of a German civilian. Erika took her plate, actual ceramic not messed in, and moved down the serving line. An American private named Collins, who'd been friendly during library shifts, served her turkey with a grin. "Dark or white meat, ma'am?" The question itself was absurd. As if choice mattered, as if there was enough to have preferences. "Dark, please." He loaded her plate. Not a thin slice, but a substantial portion, the meat falling from the bone in tender shreds. Then ham. Then brisket, because you should try it, ma'am. It's really good. Mashed potatoes with real butter melting into white peaks. Green beans with almonds. Almonds, a luxury she'd last seen in 1940. Corn glistening with butter. A roll that steamed when she broke it open, revealing soft white interior. She found a table, sat, and for a moment simply stared at the plate. Beside her, Margaret whispered, "It's real, isn't it? Not painted wood or paper mache. It's real. Then why am I afraid to eat it?" Because eating it meant accepting that everything they'd believed about enemy weakness was false. Because each bite would be an admission that their own nation, their Führer, their entire ideological framework had lied. Because the meal represented not just food, but evidence of a productive capacity so overwhelming that generosity toward enemies cost nothing. Erika cut into the turkey. The meat was moist, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, rich with flavor that transcended mere sustenance. She chewed slowly, forcing herself to acknowledge the reality. This wasn't survival rations, this was cuisine. This was a nation so wealthy, so abundant, so confident in its strength that it could feast its prisoners without strategic consequence. Around the grounds, reactions varied. Some women ate with desperate efficiency, as if the food might vanish. Others savored each bite like a religious experience. A few, Greta's holdouts, watched from the barracks windows, their hungry presence a testimony to doctrine's diminishing power. And then came the revelation within the revelation. Halfway through the meal, Erika watched Sergeant Stevens pile his own plate from the same serving line. The same food, the same portions. He sat with guards and prisoners mixed, the segregation of captor and captured temporarily suspended. Private Collins laughed at something a German wireless operator said. Captain Rosenfeld discussed medicine with a former nurse. Colonel Hayes moved between tables, ensuring everyone had enough, that no one hesitated to take seconds. They're not just feeding us, Erika realized. They're eating with us. As if we're not enemies, but people. The USO performance began at 1400 hours. A small stage had been erected, and 5 performers, 2 women in service uniforms, 3 men, took their positions. They performed songs Erika had never heard, comedy sketches that transcended language barriers through physical humor, and one haunting ballad sung by the darker-haired woman that made several prisoners cry, though they understood perhaps 1 word in 3. But the climax came when they invited volunteers from the audience to perform. The request hung in the air, awkward and impossible. German military personnel performing for American captors. Greta would rather starve than Clara stood. "I know a folk song," she said in halting English, "from my grandmother, about harvest. Is okay." The lead performer beamed. "It's more than okay. Come up." Oh, what followed shattered something fundamental. Clara sang Heiderus line, her clear soprano carrying across the grounds. It was a song of innocence, of flowers and fields, completely unpolitical, utterly human. When she finished, both guards and prisoners applauded. Then one of the American performers sang a ballad about autumn harvest, and Erika understood that songs about seasons and growing things transcended the politics that had brought them all to this desert. Others volunteered. A harmonica player, 2 women who performed a brief theatrical sketch, someone who recited a poem. The barrier between prisoner and guard didn't dissolve entirely, but it became permeable, translucent, a suggestion rather than a wall. As evening fell and the electric lights illuminated the grounds, Erika sat beside Sergeant Stevens on a bench near the edge of the festivities. "Why?" she asked. "Why this? Why go to such effort for prisoners?" Stevens was quiet for a long moment, watching the mixed groups of Americans and Germans sharing coffee and pie. "You want the official answer or the real one?" "Real. Because we can. Because showing you abundance doesn't hurt us. We've got plenty more where this came from. And because..." He paused, choosing words carefully. "Because maybe if you see that Americans are just people, not the monsters your propaganda painted, maybe someday when this war's over and you go home, you'll remember. You'll tell others. You'll question the next lie you're told." "You're trying to break us." "No." He met her eyes directly. "We're trying to show you the truth. There's a difference. Breaking you would be making you suffer. This." He gestured at the festival grounds. "This is us being exactly what we are, a rich nation that can afford to be decent even to enemies." The truth of it settled over her like the cooling desert evening. America wasn't pretending strength. It was demonstrating it through abundance, so casual it fed prisoners' feasts. That night, Erika wrote, "I am undone, not by cruelty but by kindness, not by deprivation but by abundance, not by the iron fist but by the open hand. Today I ate better than any meal in 3 years, surrounded by enemies who treated me as a guest." Greta calls it manipulation. She may be right. But if this is manipulation, what do we call 3 years of hunger while being promised victory? What do we call propaganda that told us the enemy was weak while we weakened and they feasted? The coffee cup sits on my shelf. Tomorrow I'll use it for American coffee. Real coffee, not ersatz. The cup hasn't changed, but its meaning has. Tuesday, November 16th, 1943. Camp Library. The work detail that brought Erika and Sergeant Stevens into regular contact proved to be the site of transformation's deepest excavations. The camp library, a small building stocked with books donated by local communities, newspapers censored for operational security, and magazines required cataloging and maintenance. 2 prisoners and 1 guard twice weekly for 2-hour shifts. Today, the other prisoner was Margaret. The air conditioning rattled, a luxury so profound that Erika had stopped remarking on it. They were sorting through a box of newly arrived books when Stevens brought out a newspaper he'd been instructed to censor. "Need to cut out the war updates before filing," he explained, wielding scissors. "Can't have you ladies getting tactical information." Margrethe watched him cut around an article, then raised the question Erika had been building toward for weeks. "Sergeant Stevens, why were we lied to?" He paused, scissors mid-cut. "About what specifically?" "Everything. American weakness. Your society collapsing. Your soldiers being soft and undisciplined. Your production being propaganda exaggeration." She gestured at the library, at the camp beyond. "All lies. Why?" Stephen set down the scissors, leaned back in his chair. You really want to know? Yes. Because lying about small things makes it easier to lie about big things. If your leaders can convince you that the enemy is weak when he's strong, they can convince you that war is going well when it's not, that sacrifice is temporary when it's actually bleeding you dry, that victory is certain when it's impossible. But the lies hurt Germany, Erika said, made us underestimate you, led to— She stopped, the implications cascading. Led to strategic mistakes, Stevens finished. Right, but here's the thing. Authoritarian governments don't optimize for victory. They optimize for control. If you knew America's real industrial capacity, you might question the Führer's decision to declare war. If you knew we produce 184 times more oil, 33 times more vehicles, that we feed our prisoners better than your nation feeds its soldiers, you might ask uncomfortable questions. The number 184 times hung in the air like an accusation. So the lying, Stevens continued, it's not a bug in the system. It's a feature. Keep the population believing in inevitable victory despite mounting evidence, and you maintain political control even as the nation bleeds. Erika felt something crack inside her, a foundation stone of belief giving way. Then everything, the war, the sacrifice, the hunger, it was all avoidable. Not for me to judge German politics. Stevens' voice softened slightly. But I'll say this, democracies have their flaws, God knows, but one advantage is that it's harder to lie to everyone all the time. Free press, opposition parties, open debate. These things are annoying as hell for leaders, but they make sustained mass deception difficult. Margrethe spoke quietly. In Hamburg, before I joined military, there was only one press, one party, no debate. Right, which means when that one source lies, everyone believes because there's no alternative information. Stevens picked up his scissors again. That's why this library matters, by the way. Why we let you read American magazines, newspapers, even censored ones. You're getting information from sources your government couldn't control. Makes it harder to maintain the old lies. The conversation drifted to other topics, but the seed had grown into a sapling. That night, Erika lay awake calculating. If oil production was truly 184-1, then every single German tank, plane, and truck operated under fuel constraints the Americans couldn't even imagine. If vehicle production was 33-1, then mechanized warfare, the basis of blitzkrieg doctrine, was something Germany couldn't sustain, but America could deploy endlessly. If steel production was nearly 3-1, then the math was brutal. Germany had never had a chance. The war had been lost before it began, not through military failure, but through economic impossible. And her leaders had known this, must have known, which meant— She sat up suddenly, startling Clara in the adjacent bunk. You okay? I just realized something. Something terrible. What? They knew. Our leaders. They must have known we couldn't win. Not against this. She gestured vaguely at the abundance surrounding them, which means every death, every bombing, every starving child in Hamburg. It's not tragedy. It's murder. Clara was silent for a long time. Then, don't say that where Greta can hear. She's still true believer. How? How can she still believe after seeing all this? Because belief is easier than accepting that you've been a fool, that you've sacrificed and suffered for lies, that your nation, which you loved, betrayed you. Clara's voice cracked. It's easier to call abundance a trick than accept that scarcity was unnecessary. Easier to insist that the Americans are manipulating us than accept that our own government was. The conversation died, but sleep didn't come. Outside, desert wind rattled the window screens, those meticulously manufactured screens that kept insects out. One small demonstration of industrial capacity applied to human comfort rather than human destruction. The coffee cup gleamed in moonlight, symbol and accusation. Part V, The Reckoning. Monday, February 21st, 1944. Camp Oasis, Arizona. 7 months after the Harvest Festival, a gray morning brought the revelation that would break something fundamental in the prisoner's ability to maintain denial. Colonel Hayes stood before the assembled women, his face carrying an expression Erika had never seen, grave determination mixed with something approaching regret. "Ladies," he began, his voice formal, "under the Geneva Convention, you have certain rights regarding information about the war. You also have rights to understand the nature of the conflict you've been part of. What I'm about to show you is difficult. Some of you will deny it. Some will be angry at me, at yourselves, at your leaders. But you deserve to know the truth about what's been discovered on the Eastern Front. Erika's German translation came haltingly. The phrase Eastern Front triggered immediate tension. Most of these women had served in Western Europe or North Africa. The Eastern Front was distant, spoken of in propaganda as a glorious crusade, in whispers as something else entirely. The projection equipment had been set up in the mess hall. Haze dimmed the lights. What followed broke them. Photographs first, black and white images of atrocities so systematic, so industrial in their horror that the mind struggled to process them as real. Villages destroyed not in combat, but methodically. Civilians, women, children, elderly, in mass graves. Facilities designed for killing on scales that transcended individual evil and revealed bureaucratic murder. Then documentary footage, captured from German archives. Officers calmly discussing special actions. Paperwork cataloging death with administrative precision. Evidence of crime so monstrous that propaganda's lies about enemy barbarism revealed themselves as projection. The room filled with sounds of sobbing, retching, denial. "This is Allied propaganda," Greta shouted, standing abruptly. "Fabrications to—" "These are German documents," Hayes interrupted, his voice cutting through hysteria. "German photographs, taken by German personnel. We didn't create this evidence. We discovered it." For 2 hours, the documentation continued. Each photograph, each film clip, each administrative record building an edifice of horror that couldn't be explained away, dismissed, or rationalized. This wasn't the honorable warfare they'd imagined serving. This was systematic extermination dressed in military bureaucracy. When the lights finally came up, women sat in various states of shock. Some stared at nothing. Others wept openly. A few looked angry, not at the revelations, but at being forced to confront them. Greta had gone pale, her rigid ideology visibly fracturing. Erika felt hollowed out, as if someone had reached inside and removed something essential. The coffee cup metaphor expanded. She'd believed she was drinking from civilization's vessel, but the vessel had been filled with poison all along. "I don't expect you to process this immediately," Hayes said, his voice gentle now. "We have counseling available, chaplains if you want them, or just time and space. But you needed to know what your nation did in your name, even if you didn't personally participate." That phrase, "in your name," landed like a physical blow. The women dispersed in silence, each retreating into private horror. Over the following days, the camp atmosphere changed fundamentally. The psychological impact manifested in ways both subtle and severe. 5 women stopped eating entirely, requiring medical intervention. 8 requested immediate transfer to any other facility, anywhere, to escape the knowledge. 12, including Greta, refused to leave their barracks for 3 days. 3 attempted to destroy their German military identification, as if erasing symbols could erase complicity. 1, a clerk named Anna from Berlin, tried to hang herself in the latrine. Sergeant Stevens found her in time, cut her down, held her while she screamed. The collective despair was so profound that camp operations nearly halted. The guards, trained for many contingencies, hadn't been prepared for mass moral collapse. How do you guard prisoners who no longer care about escape because they have nowhere to go? No identity left intact, no nation worth returning to. Erika spent 4 days in a state of paralyzed shock. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep beyond fitful nightmares, couldn't focus on anything beyond the images burned into memory. The question circled endlessly. How much did we know? How much did I know but refuse to see? She'd heard rumors, of course. Everyone had. Whispers about special treatment for undesirables, about camps in the east that weren't POW facilities, about trains that went east full and returned empty. But propaganda had framed these as necessary measures, harsh but required for national security. And she'd believed, or at least hadn't questioned hard enough, because questioning meant confronting implications too terrible to accept. Now acceptance was unavoidable. On the 5th day, Clara found her sitting alone in the library, staring at, but not reading a book. "We have to do something," Clara said without preamble. "Do what? We can't undo it, can't change what was done, can't—" "We can choose how we respond. We can decide whether this knowledge destroys us or transforms us." Clara's voice carried determination that surprised Erika. "I've been thinking. Next month is spring equinox. What if we organized something? A performance? A cabaret like we used to have in Munich before everything went dark? A cabaret. Erika's voice came out flat, disbelieving. After what we've seen. Because of what we've seen. Erika, if we lose the ability to laugh, to create, to be human, then we've let the horror win. We've let it consume us completely. Clara grabbed her hands. We can't change the past, but we can choose whether we let it kill our future, even if that future is just here, in this camp, for however long we're held. The audacity of the idea slowly penetrated Erika's numbness. To create beauty after confronting ugliness. To choose life after seeing industrialized death. To assert humanity after having it stripped away. The guards will never approve it, Erika said, but her voice carried the first hint of engagement in days. Sergeant Stevens already did. I asked him yesterday. He said, and I quote, "If you ladies can find reasons to laugh, that's a victory worth celebrating." The preparation for the spring equinox cabaret became collective therapy. Women who'd barely spoken in weeks found themselves arguing about comedy sketches, debating song selections, designing costumes from scavenged materials. The project offered focus beyond grief, purpose beyond mere survival. Greta initially refused participation, clinging to her ideological fortress, even as its walls crumbled. But gradually, as rehearsals filled the recreation hall with music and tentative laughter, even she began attending. Not performing, just watching from the back, her expression unreadable. Erika took responsibility for scripting. She'd studied literature before the war, had even dreamed of university. Now she channeled that training into sketches that addressed their situation with humor, sharp enough to cut but not wound. One sketch featured two prisoners arguing about whether American abundance was real or elaborate Hollywood fabrication. The punchline, they're arguing while eating chocolate bars, and one suddenly realizes, wait, if this is Hollywood magic, why does it taste so good? Another showed a German and American guard trying to communicate with increasingly absurd misunderstandings that somehow resolved into friendship over shared cigarettes. The most daring, a scene where various national propaganda stereotypes came to life, each revealing themselves as absurdly false. The weak American lifted a piano overhead. The barbaric Russian recited poetry. The effeminate Frenchman won a boxing match. And the master race German, played by Clara with devastating comic timing, couldn't figure out how to open a can of soup. That last sketch nearly caused cancellation. Greta stood up during rehearsal, trembling with rage. You mock everything we believed, everything we fought for. Clara stepped down from the makeshift stage, faced her directly. I mock lies we were told, lies that led to horrors. If we can't laugh at the absurdity of believing we were superior while we starved and those we called inferior feasted, then we've learned nothing. The confrontation hung tense for a moment, then Greta's face crumpled. If it was all lies, what was it for? My brother died at Stalingrad. My father lost his shop when he wouldn't join the party. My mother still writes about hunger in Leipzig. What was it for? Nothing, Clara said softly. It was for nothing, and that's the truth we have to live with. But we can choose what comes next. We can choose not to let the lies keep poisoning us. Greta sat down heavily, and for the first time since imprisonment, she cried. Saturday, March 18th, 1944, 1 year exactly since arrival. The recreation hall had been transformed. Makeshift curtains sewn from donated fabric. A stage constructed from wooden pallets. Lighting rigged by electrically skilled prisoners working with American engineers. Programs printed on a mimeograph machine, German text carefully formatted. Hoffnung, hope, ein Kabarett zum Frühlingsanfang, a cabaret for spring's beginning. The audience included all 50 prisoners, 30 guards, camp staff, and, unexpectedly, Colonel Hayes had invited several local civilians who donated to the camp library and recreation programs. Americans and Germans, captors and captured, seated together in rows of folding chairs. Erika stood backstage, hands trembling, wondering if this was madness. They were about to perform comedy about their own defeat, their own deception, their own nation's crimes. What kind of psychological break enabled this? Then Clara squeezed her hand. It's not madness. It's survival. It's us deciding that we're more than what was done in our name. The performance began with music, a folk song so old and unpolitical that both Germans and Americans recognized the melody. Then came the sketches, some light, some pointed, some so precisely calibrated to their shared experience that both prisoners and guards laughed at the same moments. The chocolate bar sketch killed. The propaganda stereotype scene brought down the house, but the moment that transformed the evening came unscripted. During a brief scene change, Margaret sat at a donated piano and began playing, just improvising, filling dead air. The melody was melancholy, beautiful, something pre-war and universal. Then, spontaneously, one of the American guards, Private Collins, the friendly one from the Harvest Festival, joined in with a harmonica. They hadn't rehearsed. They didn't share language or politics or history, but music transcended all of it. The German piano and American harmonica wove together in harmony that made several people openly cry. When the song ended, the applause wasn't polite. It was cathartic. The finale was Clara's masterstroke, a scene where prisoners and guards switched roles, Germans playing American guards trying to explain abundance to skeptical prisoners, played by actual American guards. The role reversal forced both sides to see through the other's eyes, and the comedy came from sudden recognition of shared humanity. Protagonist's name was caught between loyalty to his comrades and a devastating new truth. It's an impossible position. What would you have done? Let us know your thoughts below. Every comment helps this story reach more people. As the final curtain fell, literal curtain sewn by hand from donated sheets, the standing ovation mixed Americans and Germans indiscriminately. Sergeant Stevens stood next to Greta, both applauding. Colonel Hayes had tears in his eyes. Private Collins hugged Margaret. Language barrier irrelevant. In that moment, something shifted. The barrier between captor and captured didn't disappear, but it became permeable, human, negotiable. They weren't enemies performing tolerance. They were people acknowledging each other's humanity despite the war that divided them. Afterward, during the informal reception, more donated food, more casual abundance, Erika found herself in conversation with Sergeant Stevens and, surprisingly, Greta. That sketch, Greta said haltingly, addressing Clara who'd joined them. The one about the master race and the soup can. I wanted to be angry, but I realized I was laughing at myself, at how stupid we were to believe it. Belief isn't stupid, Stevens offered. Everyone believes something, but being willing to question, to laugh at what you used to believe, that takes courage. I don't feel courageous. I feel humiliated. We were so certain, so absolutely certain we were right, that our cause was just, that our victory was inevitable. Greta looked at her hands, and we were wrong about everything. Not everything, Erika said. We were right that loyalty matters. That sacrifice means something. That serving something larger than yourself gives purpose. We just aim those good instincts at a terrible cause. So what do we do now? Greta asked. When the war ends, when we go home, if there's a home to return to, what do we do with this knowledge? Stevens answered, you tell the truth. You become witnesses. You make sure the next generation knows what lies look like, what manipulation sounds like, how propaganda works. You become the inoculation against future deception. The conversation drifted, but the coffee cup metaphor completed its transformation. The vessel still existed, German-made, familiar. But what filled it now was American coffee brewed with abundance, shared in genuine exchange. The cup represented continuity, but its contents signified transformation. That night, Erika wrote, March 18th, 1944, 1 year in captivity, 1 year of having every certainty dismantled. Today we laugh together, prisoners and guards, Germans and Americans, believers and doubters. We created beauty in the aftermath of horror. We chose hope when despair would have been easier. This is not surrender. This is evolution. This is becoming human again after being reduced to ideology. The coffee cup sits on my shelf. Tomorrow I'll use it for morning coffee. The cup is German. The coffee is American. The woman drinking from it is neither and both. She is simply trying to be honest, which is harder than propaganda ever prepared her for. Tuesday, May 8th, 1945. Camp Oasis, Arizona. The announcement came over the camp's public address system at 1400 hours. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Erika heard it in the library, where she'd been cataloging new arrivals, a task she'd continued long after it was required, finding comfort in the organizational precision. The words hung in the air: unconditional surrender, total defeat. Everything they'd been promised, the 1,000-year Reich, the final victory, the triumph of will over material, revealed as fantasy. Around the camp, reactions varied wildly. Some women collapsed in tears. Relief, grief, exhaustion finally released. Others sat in stunned silence. A few, surprisingly, cheered, not for Germany's defeat, but for the ending of bloodshed, the cessation of destruction, the hope that families might survive. Greta's response was most striking. She went to her footlocker, removed her military decorations and identification papers, and burned them in the coal stove. "I won't carry these lies anymore," she said simply. "Let them burn with the regime that created them." The next weeks brought a flood of information previously withheld. Newspapers, now uncensored, revealed the full scope of Germany's collapse. Photographs showed Berlin in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, civilians starving in numbers that made the prisoners' previous deprivation seem trivial by comparison. The nation they'd served no longer meaningfully existed. Letters from family, delayed by the wars and chaos, painted devastating pictures. Erika's mother wrote from Hamburg, "The city is 75% destroyed. We live in the basement of what used to be our building. Water comes from public pumps. Food is whatever the occupation forces distribute. I weigh 89 pounds, but I'm alive, and that's more than many can say." Clara's family in Munich reported similar devastation. Margret's parents in Düsseldorf had disappeared entirely. The letters returned marked "Address no longer exists." The contrast was brutal. The prisoners, healthy and well-fed from 2 years of American abundance, faced returning to a homeland destroyed, starving, occupied, and ideologically bankrupt. June 15, 1945, Camp Commandant's office. Colonel Hayes called a general assembly. "Ladies, repatriation orders have arrived. Within 3 months, you'll be returned to Germany, processed through occupation channels, and released to civilian life. The war is over. You're going home." Home. The word carried such complex weight. Home to rubble, home to hunger, home to a society that had built itself on lies and now had to confront truth. Home to families who might not have survived. Home to a nation that no longer existed in any meaningful form. That evening, an unprecedented conversation began in the barracks. Erika found herself at the center of it, along with Clara, Margrethe, and, surprisingly, Greta. "What if we didn't go back?" Clara voiced what several had been thinking. "What if we petitioned for asylum?" The suggestion hung like blasphemy. To abandon homeland, even defeated homeland, seemed like ultimate betrayal. "On what grounds?" Margrethe asked practically. "We're military personnel, enemy combatants. Why would America grant us asylum?" "Political asylum," Erika said slowly, thinking through the legal framework she'd learned from library reading. "If we can demonstrate that returning poses danger, not physical necessarily, but political persecution for having been exposed to American treatment, for knowing the truths we've learned, for potentially testifying about what we've witnessed." Greta spoke quietly. "Or we could argue that we're seeking to build new lives based on principles we've learned here: freedom, democracy, truth over propaganda. That we've been transformed by our imprisonment and can't return to a society built on the ashes of everything we now reject." The conversation intensified. 12 women ultimately joined the discussion, each wrestling with the implications: arguments for return, family obligations, national loyalty despite disagreement with regime duty to help rebuild, avoiding appearance of desertion, uncertainty about American acceptance, arguments for asylum, homeland no longer existentially exists, family members missing or dead, skills and education applicable in America, desire to live in a democracy after experiencing its effects, fear of returning to society that might punish exposure to American abundance, belief that building new life represents growth, not betrayal. The debate consumed days. Ultimately, 12 women decided to petition. The document they drafted, with help from Sergeant Stevens, who'd become more counselor than guard, argued, We, the undersigned, respectfully petition the United States government for political asylum on the following grounds. We have witnessed firsthand the contrast between totalitarian deception and democratic transparency. We have experienced the difference between scarcity manufactured by authoritarian control and abundance generated by free systems. We have learned that our nation's ideology was built on lies that led to unspeakable crimes. Returning to Germany means returning to a society that must now confront these truths without the benefit of the education we've received. We fear persecution not for our wartime service, but for our post-war knowledge. More importantly, we seek to build lives based on the principles we've learned during imprisonment: honest governance, free inquiry, democratic participation, and human dignity regardless of origin. We do not seek asylum as deserters, but as students who've learned lessons our homeland is only beginning to confront. Erika signed first, then Clara. Margrethe hesitated for a full minute before adding her name. Greta's signature came last, her hand shaking, but her resolve clear. August 3, 1945, federal immigration hearing, Phoenix, Arizona. The asylum hearing took place in a borrowed federal courthouse. An immigration judge, flanked by military liaisons and State Department observers, reviewed their petition with a skepticism Erika understood. Why grant asylum to former enemy combatants when thousands of displaced persons had stronger claims? The judge asked pointed questions. Erika served as primary spokesperson, her English now fluent after 2 years of immersion. Miss Schneider, what makes your case different from any other German prisoner who prefers American comfort to German rubble? With respect, sir, this isn't about comfort. It's about transformation. We don't seek asylum because America is wealthy and Germany is poor. We seek it because we've learned that systems matter, that free societies produce not just abundance but accountability, that democracy, for all its messiness, prevents the kind of systematic deception that led our nation into catastrophic war. Noble words, but you served the Nazi regime for years. Why should we believe your conversion is genuine? Greta answered that one. Because genuine conversion isn't painless, sir. It's excruciating. It means accepting that you were a fool, that people died because of lies you believed, that your nation, which you loved, betrayed everything decent. If we were merely seeking comfort, we'd claim we were always secretly opposed. Instead, we admit we were true believers who were wrong. That admission costs more than you can imagine. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Colonel Hayes testified on their behalf. These women have demonstrated consistent engagement with democratic principles, intellectual curiosity, and moral courage in confronting uncomfortable truths. They've become assets to our re-education efforts and have influenced other prisoners toward accepting Germany's defeat and the need for fundamental reform. Sergeant Stevens also spoke. I've watched these ladies transform from ideological soldiers into thoughtful individuals. They ask hard questions. They challenge their own assumptions. They've learned the difference between propaganda and truth. Sending them back to Germany isn't wrong, but keeping them here as examples of transformation's possibility that serves both nations' interests. The judge deliberated for 2 weeks. August 17, 1945. The decision. Of the 12 petitioners, 5 received provisional asylum: Erika Schneider, Clara Hoffmann, Margrethe Fischer, Greta Zimmermann, and a signals operator named Johanna Briekst. The others were denied, not for lack of merit, but due to family obligations that took priority, or minor complications in their military service records. The asylum came with conditions: 3-year provisional status, mandatory English language proficiency testing, quarterly reporting to immigration authorities, sponsorship by American citizens or organizations, prohibition from traveling to Germany during provisional period, permanent asylum contingent on good behavior and integration. The 5 women who received approval cried, not purely from joy, but from the overwhelming complexity of emotions: relief, grief for homeland lost, anxiety about unknown futures, gratitude mixed with guilt for the opportunity others lacked. The remaining prisoners, including 38 who'd never considered asylum, prepared for repatriation. The farewell scene on September 5, 1945 was wrenching. Women who'd shared 2.5 years of transformation, who'd witnessed each other's psychological journeys, now separating into different futures. One prisoner, Anna, The woman who'd attempted suicide after the atrocity revelations hugged Erika fiercely before boarding the transport truck. "Tell them," she whispered, "tell the Americans that not all Germans were monsters, that some of us learned, that some of us changed." "I will, I promise. And when enough time has passed, when Germany has rebuilt not just buildings, but souls, come visit. Show us how to build a democracy. We'll need teachers." The trucks departed, carrying women back to a homeland that existed more in memory than reality. The 5 who remained stood at the gate, watching dust clouds disappear into the desert horizon, feeling simultaneously liberated and unmoored. December 1945, Phoenix, Arizona. The transition from prisoner to resident proved more complex than any anticipated. The 5 women were sponsored by various organizations. Erika by a Lutheran church group, Clara by a university seeking to study post-war German psychology, Margaret by a family who'd lost sons in Europe and sought to build bridges, Greta by a labor union interested in her administrative skills, and Johanna by a library system. Erika found work at a bookstore while attending night classes in English literature at a local college. The owner, Mr. Harold Peterson, had fought in World War I and initially hired her reluctantly, yielding to church pressure. But her knowledge of German literature, her meticulous work ethic, and her ability to recommend books based on subtle customer cues transformed skepticism into respect. "You know," he told her 3 months in, "when Reverend Miller asked me to hire a German prisoner, I thought he'd lost his mind. But you're the best employee I've ever had." "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Though I should correct, not prisoner anymore. Resident." "Right, resident." He paused. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "How do you do it? Come from everything that happened, see what your country did, and just keep going." "Most people would be destroyed by that knowledge." Erika considered carefully. "I was destroyed. In Camp Oasis, after seeing the documentation of crimes, I wanted to die, wanted to erase myself because existing as a German felt like complicity. But then Clara said something wise. The only way to honor the victims is to live differently, to become proof that transformation is possible, to be a witness that says this person believed lies, learned truth, and changed. If I destroy myself, I'm just another casualty. If I live honestly, I'm evidence that education and exposure can defeat propaganda." The coffee cup, which she'd been allowed to keep from her prisoner belongings, now sat on her apartment's single shelf. A small room in a boarding house, modest by American standards but palatial compared to Hamburg basements. She used it daily, and with each use, its meaning deepened. A reminder that objects persist while meanings transform, that vessels outlast their contents, that identity is constructed, not inherited. January 1948. 3 years post-liberation, the provisional asylum period ended with final immigration hearings. All 5 women qualified for permanent residency. The judge who'd initially questioned their sincerity now signed papers with a note. Exemplary integration. Recommend full citizenship eligibility at earliest opportunity. By this point, Erika had completed her bachelor's degree in literature and was pursuing graduate studies, focusing on propaganda analysis and totalitarian ideology. Clara had married an American veteran and was training as a social worker specializing in trauma recovery. Margaret ran a small translation business, bridging German and English communities. Greta had become a union organizer, applying her organizational skills to worker protections. Johanna managed the foreign language section at Phoenix Public Library. They remained close, meeting monthly for dinner and conversation that mixed English and German freely. These gatherings served as mutual support and collective memory, ensuring they never forgot the journey from true believers to critical thinkers. April 1963. 20 years post-war. A documentary filmmaker from UCLA sought out former German POWs for a project on America's prisoner of war program. Erika, now Dr. Schneider with a PhD in political science and a teaching position at Arizona State University, agreed to an interview. The filmmaker asked standard questions about camp conditions, treatment, daily life. Then came the deeper inquiry. Dr. Schneider, looking back 20 years, what was the single most significant moment in your transformation from German soldier to American citizen? Erika thought carefully, aware that her answer would be preserved on film, potentially shown to students for decades. It wasn't a single moment, but an accumulation. But if I had to choose one crystallizing experience, it was the Harvest Festival in October 1943, sitting there with a plate containing more protein than German civilians saw in weeks, watching guards and prisoners eat together, seeing abundance so casual that generosity toward enemies cost nothing. That's when I understood that propaganda hadn't just lied about American weakness. It had inverted reality. Everything we'd been told was backwards. The degenerate were disciplined. The weak were strong. The collapsing society possessed unlimited capacity. That reversal, realizing the world was precisely opposite our training, that broke something fundamental. After that, every subsequent revelation made sense because I'd accepted that my framework was wrong. Do you regret the path you've taken, choosing asylum over return? I regret that it was necessary. I wish Germany had never fallen to National Socialism. I wish the war had never happened. I wish I'd been raised in a society that valued truth over propaganda. But given the reality I faced, no, I don't regret asylum. I regret only that more Germans didn't have the opportunity to learn what I learned, to see what I saw, to transform as I was allowed to transform. What do you say to Germans who might view you as a traitor? That patriotism isn't blind loyalty to a regime. It's love of your people. And the best thing I can do for German people is become evidence that transformation is possible, that democracy works, that societies built on lies eventually collapse, but individuals can rebuild themselves on truth. If that's treason, so be it. But I think it's the opposite. It's the highest form of patriotism, refusing to let your nation's crimes define your future. The interview ran for 3 hours, covering topics from daily camp routines to philosophical implications of ideological transformation. When it concluded, the filmmaker thanked her and said, "You know, we've interviewed 40 former POWs, but your insight into the psychological dimensions, that's unique." Perhaps because I've spent 20 years studying what happened to me. When you experience total ideological collapse, you either understand it deeply or you're destroyed by it. I chose understanding. September 1975, 30 years post-war. Erika received an unexpected letter from Hamburg. Her mother had died 6 months prior, the news delayed by poor record-keeping, but a cousin had located her through American immigration records. Enclosed was a box of letters Erika had sent from Camp Oasis, carefully preserved. Reading her own words from 1943 and 1945, Erika traced the transformation in real time. Early letters were circumspect, uncertain if censors would permit honesty, but gradually, as trust built, the truth emerged. "Mother, I don't know how to tell you this, but everything we believed was wrong. The Americans aren't weak. We're weak. They're not starving. We're starving. They don't need propaganda to maintain morale because their reality is better than any propaganda could claim." And later, I've decided to request asylum, not because I hate Germany, but because I can't return to a society that hasn't learned what I've learned. Maybe someday, when enough truth has penetrated, when enough lies have been confronted, but not yet. I have to build a new life based on honesty, and I can only do that here. Her mother had kept every letter, despite the dangerous admission they represented. A final note in her mother's handwriting, dated months before her death, simply read, "I understand. I'm proud of you. Live well." Erika wept for her mother, for lost years, for the Germany that might have been if truth had prevailed over propaganda, but also for the life she'd built, the transformation she'd achieved, the person she'd become. The coffee cup, now 43 years old, sat on her university office shelf. Students sometimes asked about it, a simple white ceramic vessel among books and academic paraphernalia. What's the significance of the cup? It's a reminder that identity is what we choose, not what we inherit, that objects persist while meanings transform, that the vessel matters less than what fills it. Most students nodded politely, not fully understanding, but occasionally one would grasp the deeper meaning and ask, "What fills it now?" "Truth," Erika would answer, "as best as I can determine it," which is harder than propaganda ever prepared me for, but also more rewarding. May 8, 1995. 50 years after German surrender, Arizona State University hosted a symposium on World War II's end, inviting veterans, survivors, and scholars. Dr. Erika Schneider, now 75 and Professor Emerita, delivered the keynote address. Her once dark hair was silver, her posture slightly stooped, but her voice carried the same clarity that had guided thousands of students through complex historical analysis. She stood before an audience of 300 students, veterans, academics, German-American community members, and began not with analysis, but with a story. 50 years ago today, I was a prisoner of war in an Arizona desert camp, learning that my nation had surrendered unconditionally. I was 25 years old, a true believer in National Socialist ideology, and utterly certain of my worldview's correctness. Within 2 years, everything I believed had been systematically dismantled, not through torture or coercion, but through something far more powerful: exposure to truth and abundance. She walked the audience through her journey, the initial shock of American physical strength, the harvest festival's overwhelming abundance, the library conversations that planted doubt, the atrocity documentation that shattered denial, the cabaret that rebuilt humanity, and finally the choice to seek asylum rather than return to comfortable lies. I tell you this not to praise America uncritically. Democracies have their own failures, their own propaganda, their own capacity for self-deception. I tell you this to illustrate a simple principle: sustained lies require information control. When that control breaks, when reality intrudes, when people see with their own eyes the gap between propaganda and truth, transformation becomes possible. She paused, sipping from a white ceramic cup she'd brought to the podium. Several audience members who knew her story smiled at the symbol. This cup is German-made, circa 1940. It survived the war, survived my capture, survived decades of use. It's just a cup, but it represents something crucial: continuity through transformation. I'm still German by birth and culture, but I'm American by choice and values. The cup hasn't changed. What fills it has changed everything. The speech concluded with a warning and a hope. In every generation, new propagandas emerge, new lies dressed as truth, new deceptions wrapped in nationalism or ideology or religious certainty. The antidote isn't cynicism. Don't believe nothing. The antidote is critical thinking, free inquiry, willingness to question, and exposure to perspectives that challenge your certainty. When someone tells you the enemy is subhuman, ask why. When someone claims inevitable victory despite mounting evidence otherwise, investigate. When someone demands unquestioning loyalty, run. But here's my hope: transformation is always possible. I was as indoctrinated as any human can be, raised in a society that controlled information from birth, trained in military discipline that punished dissent. And yet, when confronted with undeniable reality, when shown abundance that contradicted lies about enemy weakness, when treated with humanity despite being an enemy, I changed. If I can transform, anyone can. That's not naive optimism. It's evidence-based hope. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Afterward, during the reception, a young German exchange student approached nervously. "Dr. Schneider, I read your book about ideological transformation. My grandfather was Wehrmacht, fought on Eastern Front. He never talked about the war, died when I was 12. I always wondered what he experienced, what he believed, whether he changed." Erika took the student's hand gently. Many soldiers couldn't talk about it. The shame was too great, the transformation too painful, or they never transformed at all and carried the lies to their graves. But the fact that you're here, studying in America, asking these questions, that suggests he wanted something different for you. That's a legacy worth honoring. Did it ever get easier, knowing what your nation did? No. It got more complex, more nuanced, more layered with understanding, but not easier. I learned to live with it, to channel the knowledge into education and witness. But the weight never fully lifts. That's appropriate. Some knowledge should weigh on us. It prevents forgetting. December 2003. Dr. Schneider's final lecture. At 83, Dr. Erika Schneider delivered her last lecture before retirement. The university auditorium filled beyond capacity, students sitting in aisles standing at the back, gathering to hear a final address from a woman who'd become legend in political science circles. She spoke for 90 minutes without notes, weaving together personal narrative and historical analysis, demonstrating how one woman's story illuminated universal truths about power, propaganda, transformation, and human dignity. The conclusion focused on lessons learned. In 60 years of reflection, I've identified key principles that transcend my specific experience. First, Propaganda works by controlling comparison. If you never see alternatives, you can't recognize lies. The moment I saw American abundance, German propaganda lost its power because comparison revealed truth. Second, ideological certainty is often proportional to information restriction. The more certain you are, the more you should question what you don't know. True confidence welcomes challenge. False confidence demands isolation from contrary evidence. Third, transformation requires both crisis and support. The crisis breaks old frameworks. The support prevents collapse into nihilism or despair. I needed both the shock of truth and the community that helped me rebuild. Fourth, patriotism divorced from truth becomes tribalism. Loving your country means wanting it to be better, which requires honest assessment of its flaws. Blind loyalty serves leaders, not nations. Fifth, the most dangerous lies are those mixed with truth. Nazi propaganda didn't invent everything. It took real grievances from Versailles, real economic suffering, real German cultural achievements, and weaponized them through selective falsehood. Teaching people to recognize partial truths is harder than exposing total fabrications, but it's essential. Finally, redemption is possible but never complete. I will die having been part of a regime that committed unspeakable evil, even if my personal participation was administrative and relatively minor. That stain doesn't wash away, but I can spend my life being evidence that people can change, learn, grow beyond their indoctrination. That's not redemption, it's responsibility. She paused, emotional for the first time in the lecture. When I arrived at Camp Oasis in March 1943, I was a servant of lies. When I left in 1945, I was a student of truth. 60 years later, I'm still studying, still learning, still questioning my certainties. If I've taught you anything, let it be this. Question everything, including, especially, what I've told you today. Verify. Compare. Think critically. That's how propaganda dies. That's how truth survives. The standing ovation lasted until she had to wave them down, laughing, saying, "Save your energy for your final exams. You'll need it." March 18, 2008, 65 years after arrival. The Arizona Historical Society contacted Dr. Schneider with an unusual request. They were curating an exhibit on World War II POW camps in the Southwest and had heard about her famous coffee cup. Would she consider donating it to the collection? Erika, now 88 and in declining health, held the cup for a long time before answering. It was chipped now, the glaze crazed with age, the base worn from 6.5 decades of daily use. But it remained fundamentally intact, just a cup, simple and functional. "No," she said finally, "not yet. When I die, yes, include it in the exhibit with the full story. But while I'm alive, I still use it. It reminds me every morning who I was and who I chose to become." "We understand," the curator said. "But may I ask, what do you drink from it now?" Erika smiled. "Same thing as always, coffee, American coffee, brewed strong. Though these days I add extra cream. Age has made me softer in some ways." "Do you ever regret not returning to Germany, not being part of the rebuilding?" "I returned many times after the provisional period ended, lectured at German universities, consulted on democratization programs, maintained relationships with family and colleagues. But my life was here. My transformation happened here. And, honestly," she gestured around her modest home, filled with books in German and English, photographs spanning decades, accumulated evidence of a life fully lived. "Germany rebuilt itself quite well without me. Better, perhaps. They didn't need old believers preaching new faith. They needed a new generation raised in democracy. I contributed from here as witness and scholar." September 15th, 2011. Dr. Erika Schneider's death. She died peacefully in her sleep at 91, surrounded by the artifacts of 8 decades. German military photographs, American university diplomas, books she'd written on propaganda and transformation, letters from former students, grandchildren's drawings, Clara's family, whom Erika had adopted as her own, having never married. And on the nightstand, that white ceramic cup, empty now for the final time. The funeral mixed German and American traditions. Former students spoke alongside family members. The eulogy, delivered by one of her earliest students, who'd become a prominent political scientist himself, captured her essential contribution. Dr. Schneider taught us that transformation isn't betrayal, it's evolution. That questioning isn't weakness, it's strength. That changing your mind when confronted with evidence isn't flip-flopping, it's integrity. She lived proof that humans are not fixed by their origins, but defined by their choices. She chose truth over comfort, complexity over certainty, and growth over stagnation. In doing so, she became the best kind of teacher, one who demonstrated principles through lived experience rather than abstract theory. Present day, the exhibit. The Arizona Historical Society's exhibit on Southwest POW camps features a small glass case in the center. Inside sits a white ceramic coffee cup, circa 1940, German-made, heavily worn. The placard reads, "The Transformation Cup." This ordinary coffee cup belonged to Oberfeldwebel Erika Schneider, a German signals operator captured in North Africa and interned at Camp Oasis, Arizona, from March 1943 to September 1945. During her imprisonment, this cup witnessed her transformation from National Socialist true believer to American democratic citizen. Dr. Schneider used this cup daily for 68 years, from 1943 until her death in 2011. She wrote, "The cup is German, the coffee is American. The woman drinking from it learned that identity is constructed through choices, not inherited through birth. This simple vessel taught me that what we fill ourselves with matters more than where we come from." Dr. Schneider became a prominent scholar of propaganda, authoritarianism, and ideological transformation, spending 5 decades teaching students to recognize manipulation and value truth. Her life demonstrated that even deep indoctrination can be overcome through exposure to reality, critical thinking, and willingness to question certainty. The cup remains chipped and worn, bearing evidence of daily use across decades. It stands as metaphor. We are all vessels that can be filled with lies or truth, propaganda or evidence, hatred or understanding. What we choose to fill ourselves with determines who we become. Visitors often pause at this case longer than others. The cup is unremarkable, plain white ceramic, no decorations, functional rather than beautiful. Yet something about its ordinariness makes the story more powerful. If transformation can be represented by something this simple, this everyday, this accessible, perhaps transformation itself is more achievable than we imagine. School groups visit regularly. Teachers use Dr. Schneider's story to discuss critical thinking, propaganda recognition, and the importance of questioning authority. Students write essays contemplating what their own transformation cups might be, what simple objects witness their growth and change. The cup sits there still, empty but full of meaning, German-made but American-homed, chipped but intact, silent but eloquent. A testament to the truth that abundance defeats lies, that reality eventually overwhelms propaganda, and that human beings possess remarkable capacity to transform when confronted with undeniable evidence and treated with unexpected decency. The coffee is long since cold, but the lesson remains hot, urgent, essential. Question everything, compare relentlessly, think critically, and never believe anyone who tells you inquiry is dangerous. That's how propaganda dies. That's how truth survives. That's how ordinary people, prisoners of ideology, become free citizens of reality. Dr. Erika Schneider never forgot the Harvest Festival feast, the library conversations with Sergeant Stevens, the cabaret that restored humanity, or the moment she chose asylum over return. But most of all, she never forgot that first morning in Camp Oasis, when she saw guards who embodied everything propaganda had said was impossible, abundance that revealed lies through simple existence, and treatment that demonstrated democracy through practice rather than preaching. The master race discovered it was mastered by deception. The superior ideology proved inferior to evidence. The inevitable victory became undeniable defeat. And in that collapse of certainty, in that painful transformation from believer to questioner, Erika Schneider found something propaganda had never offered. Freedom not from rules, but from lies. Liberty not from constraint, but from deception. And truth not as weapon, but as foundation. She carried those lessons in a simple cup, refilled daily, used constantly, Never taken for granted, the vessel outlasted the ideology it once served. The woman outlived the regime that trained her, and the truth, painful and liberating in equal measure, proved more durable than any lie, no matter how often repeated or forcefully imposed. That's the final lesson of the coffee cup. Truth persists, propaganda fades, regimes collapse, but honest inquiry, critical thinking, and willingness to change when confronted with evidence, these endure across generations, teaching each new cohort that freedom begins not with rebellion, but with the simple question, what if what I've been told is wrong? Erika Schneider asked that question in March 1943. She spent 68 years living the answer.